Welcome back, my friends. Good morning, and this is another installment of the Fat Man GM review or revisitation of MERP, Iron Crown Enterprises Middle Earth role-playing game system from the late 80s, early 90s. This particular installment is part of the Fortresses of Middle Earth. It is called the Halls of the Elven King. Uh, those of you who've watched The Hobbit, the Peter Jackson's version of The Hobbit, have seen quite a bit about Thundril and where Legolas's father and Legolas lived, and their wilderness, their forest fortress slash palace slash community, so forth. And this is because these are very well established characters in their own right in a very important key location in the north. What we don't see is a lot of the detail. And this is why these things are so good to have, because I can watch those movies and I've read all this stuff, so I can really envision what's going on when we only see bits and pieces in a movie. What I was impressed with Peter Jackson was that his layout and the internal looks of the halls of the Elven King actually are quite close to what's in these. Not 100%, but quite close. The let's just look at this overview 3D map, giving you a cutaway internal version of what you saw. And if you look at the movies, you see a lot like it. So I think that these played an influence to some degree to with the writers and designers for the movie. That's just my opinion. Of course, not 100% exact. There's the entrance to it, but it is what it is. Now, as fortresses go, it's a pretty good thing. The home of Legolas and Thundril. Yeah. The book itself, it's a mini source book, of course, and so it establishes the area of northern Mirkwood, specifically the realm of the Wood Elves. It gives you all the mechanics and conversion charts for running between. We've got the D100 system, the D20 system, the D6 system, and the D12 systems. So you can make easy adjustments to whatever system you prefer, mechanic-wise. If you're not using the Rollmaster system, or the Rollmaster created Iron Crown's created game mechanics for the game system, you can use Pathfinder, use Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't matter because they translate. It's the world that makes the difference. And is what it is. So we get the background, the establishment of it, the Great March of the Elves, the Nandor, which are the Wood Elves, and the small group of advanced. Not advanced, but they're Silver Elves. Let me see if I can find it. All right. Said the Nandor, the Linwese Elves, the Nadar settled throughout the vales of the Unadin, south of the Ariak, the old river ford. For more than 1,000 years, they remained content living in harmony with the flora and fauna nearby. The kindred of the Talari were especially gifted in song. The beauty and power of their singing recalled the music of Iluvatar and the valor. The magic of the elven voices stirred the spirits of all living things, from trees to flowers to birds to beasts. Some beings gained power of speech and song, skills which otherwise would have slumbered on. The descendants of these beings were thought to be kings and lords of their kind, and were hailed as magical creatures by the folk of later ages. Over the years, the Nandor developed their own ways and customs. The lore was rooted in the earth and the waters, which they cherished most of all. The Nandor knew that more about tending and cherishing of growing things than any other race since. They explored the land about them, following streams and rivers to their source. While the kindred was sundered several times by these wanderings, most Nandar remained in the woods around the wide lake called Palion, into which the torrents of the Unadin ran before crashing down to the Fault Ruros. Eventually, Paris' training was interrupted. Blah blah blah. Protected Thingol, the king of Sindar, thus the Nana remained largely escaped the cataclysm that shook the Beleriand during the Goblin Wars. So too they escaped the bloody war of Palzar, which raged after the awakening of men, the second children of Iluvatar. The first age grew to the close. The land around Nadar was vast and mostly free of other folk, but for the dwarves and Moria and migrating clans of men. At the end of the first age, blah blah. First across the Blue Mountains were Selborne and the Gladder of the Mice. They also left the Beleriad just before the fall. They're followed by Amdar and his house, who settled amongst the Sylvan elves southwest of Lake Pelion in the land called Lorend, eventually Lothlorien. Amdar was followed by turn by Ulfr, who would be the king of the Sylvan elves and Thundril's father. So basically, this is why Legolas and his father look a little different from the rest of his elves, and they are of the same higher race of elves as Galadriel and Selborne, and in doing so, they basically set up their own kingdom filled with Sylvan elves, i.e., wood elves, and wild elves for the most part. So this is where we get the small cater of high elves ruling a much larger group of lesser elves, or common elves, however you want to look at it. Then we got chapter Thundril in the Third Age, Rise and Fall of Dol Guldur, Fort Glider, Thundril's army. Gives all the information you need. We see the awesome visuals in the Battle of Five Armies when you see Thundril's woodland army in its glory. Here it talks about the strength of the army, the other brotherhoods, formations, dress, weapons, and equipment. The kings, although I think there's a much more variety here than what shows in the movie. In the movie, just because it's mostly CGI, and it's an impressive formation. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they move like a freaking machine, right? It's an awesome thing to see. But I don't think it's a true visualization of the woodland army. I think there was far more in the way of because they mention it in somewhere else in Lord of the Rings. It gets mentioned, and it comes up in the source books and the game books a number of times as well. That especially at the Battle of Dagorlad, when the last alliance of elves and men get together to bring down Morgoth, and when the ring gets cut from his hand, Thundril's father leads a contingent of his Sylvan elves to join with Gilligad and Elrod Elvish army to support the attack. They're more lightly armored and lightly armed as compared to the heavier arms and armor of their higher, of the Nodal and Elvish clans. So I think it's more of a truer representation. My vision would be these ranger-like wood elves that Legolas so predominantly just portrays, and a large contingent of a lot of them just acting like he would. So they work better in smaller groups and as individuals, and then as a collective machine, like we see in the Battle of Five Armies. I think that army there would be much more conducive to what you would have found in Lothlorien and in Lindon. But that's just my opinion. Okay, so and then we got the tale, the halls, how the halls were created, the stories behind them. It gives you a good idea why Thundril and the Thor and his family's view of Thundril, and so why there's so much conflict between the leadership of the dwarves and the leadership of the woodland elves. Why that's so personal between them. And we've got our traditional breakdown of the interior of the fortress / palace with all the rooms laid out in the main categories, main halls. Like I said, this fantastic 3D version of it. The main feasting hall and storage rooms, foundries, entry hall, guardhouse, so on and so forth. Got a nice little detailed view of the foundry. Okay. I always like stuff like this because, especially in my younger years, because it gave me inspiration and working knowledge of how to create my own version of things like this. So when I create my worlds of locations and stuff, there's some distinct visual flair to it that I can attribute to having a lot of this kind of material, specifically Iron Crown Enterprises stuff. Well, I I really like Dungeons and Dragons mechanics in the core books and all the supporting books. That's the bread and butter of my gaming experience. Uh, the soul and flavor, the heart, if you will, come from Iron Crown Enterprises, Rollmaster, MERP, because there's so much flavor. Now in Dungeons and Dragons, things got better when they introduced things like the two worlds of Faerun, i.e., the Forgotten Realms, and Dragonlance. While I'm not a fan of Dragonlance directly, and I don't mean I have anything, I like Dragonlance. Don't get me wrong. I just didn't buy into it. It's it's apples and oranges, right? They're both fruit. But when you're dealing with a budget, not all of us are wealthy people. Not all of us can go out and spend $100 a week on this stuff. And there was a period of time when I was a bachelor, between my first marriage and my second marriage, I spent the equivalent of $50 a week at Ivor's Dungeon at the game store. $50 a week in 80s and 90s money. So that's the equivalent of $100 today. And so that's one of the reasons I have such a large stockpile of stuff from that era. And when you think about it, the average source book was $20, $15 to $20, and the average module was $10 to $15. And then I bought some lead miniatures, sadly, of which most of my lead miniatures did not survive storage at my mother's house, and somehow or another ended up at the bottom of a woodchuck's hole or lost. It's what it is. But I was averaging $50 a week, so I'd buy a source book, I'd buy a module or something along these lines, and then I would buy a couple packs of one or two packs, bubble packs of miniatures, and that's what I averaged, so 200 a month. And while I didn't buy too many of the D&D modules. I know a lot more in the Forgotten Realms modules, but very few of the original D&D stuff. In part because one of the things I didn't like about them is they're one-shot wonders. What I mean by that is that they're very central, very narrow and focused, and once you use them, you can't really reuse them in the same campaign unless you're very creative. If you're just using for standalones, that's great. But having a slew of those, it made more sense economically to me to, instead of buying one or two of those, buying another source book. So I heavily concentrated on the more expensive books because it was just, I could get more bang for my buck that way. It wasn't until Iron Crown came out with this system that I started realizing that if you missed any of the modules, let me rephrase that. Most of the early modules, you're missing a key piece of Middle Earth. You needed those modules because everything fit together as a puzzle. Now, a little bit later into the creation of MERP, Iron Crown Enterprises, some of their writers and designers started taking on that cracker box McDonald's style that D&D liked to do in the early days. So some of those modules, and I'll make comments to that effect, that these are pretty much could be in any module in any game system because they don't do enough for backstory creation. Now, Forgotten Realms, on the other hand, started, I don't know, I think they took some of their creative writers and stuff from the same mindset of me because a lot of those modules are place sensitive, which because it's a world, larger world, you can find it and fit it into the picture. So there's a lot more additional uses to that. But I didn't buy all that many of them either because I'm back to that. I'd rather have the source books that have a lot more material substance in them than a couple of game aids as in the modules. That's just my opinion. So now I'm off on a tirade on that. Like I said, basic stats and stuff like that. And we got the typical tree forts because we all know the elves don't necessarily live in the damn ground. They're big, especially the wood elves. Most of them like to live in the forest and the trees. We have a couple kernel ideas for adventures in and around the halls of the Elven King, but here's some cutaway revisions of some of the elvish tree forts or tree houses, if you will. And I like these things because this is, to me, what it means to be a Sylvan elf to some degree. And I've created entire Sylvan communities where they're all elevated and in the grounds. One of the things above ground. This is one of the things I loved about the elves in that aspect, because I like having complexity to some degree. So when you create a city for humans, yeah, you can have your sewers, you have your rooftops, and you have your main levels. And yet, when you create a woodland city where you have layers of differing layers above each other, it's and with an open venue to some degree, it's exotic enough to be different enough to be very entertaining if you don't overdo it. Yeah, it's flavor. There you go. Halls of the Elven King. Nice addition to anybody's collection if you can get it. Good usable material in here. Great ideas for creating your own stuff.